Okay, let's start with the second day of the conference. My name is Zoltán Imre and I'm going to host this session. And we are going to have three very interesting presentations, and after the three presentations we have a small time for discussion. Okay, let's start with Tania Arcimovich. She is from Belarus and she is going to talk about the phenomenon of Junost studio between modernism and avant-garde. And Tania is a scholar, curator and art critic. She graduated from Belarus State Academy of Arts in Minsk, and she holds an MA in sociology as well. Tania, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for introduction. I'm really happy to be here, and I'm open for your questions and comments and so on, because for me it's really important to move somehow further my research. Because this paper I present is a part of the research I did a year ago, titled Experimental Theatre in Belarusian Soviet Socialistic Republic during the Khrushchev Thaw between Modernism and Avant-Garde. And the goal of the research was to describe experimental theatre practice in the BSSR during this time and analyze these practices within the frame of avant-garde theory and as an alternative theatre phenomenon in East Europe. Shortly in my research, I use the theoretical model by James M. Harding, who understands the avant-garde as an artistic practice where political, social and aesthetic dimension play a key role, and at the same time as a lens to see the history through the eyes of the vanquished, as he adverts to Walter Benjamin idea. Harding's concept of multiplicity of avant-gardes and non-synchronous temporalities form the basis of my research. I'm going to present here just a fragment of the chapter about Junost studio. From Russia it means Yath studio, which was one of the main experimental theatres in the BSSR at the time. I will describe the history of the studio and will talk about the main facts, focusing on its director Vladimir Balabokhin, describing and analyzing social, political and cultural circumstances in the frame of the post-colonial issue. In my research, I argue that it was only traces of the avant-gardes here. Some notes before I start. On the one hand, I describe Belarusian Soviet context as a part of Soviet Union, but on the other hand, I distinguish Belarus, discovering and focusing on the differences, which are also the goal of my research. My paper is based on archive documents as well as on the interviews I conducted with still alive actor of the studio Valery Shushkevich and its artist and later director Vladimir Matrosov. So, the beginnings of theatre studio movement in USSR was a result of the Khrushchev Thaw, when repression and censorship in the Soviet Union were relaxed, the borders of permitted became more flexible, and some changes in institution systems happened. These factors made possible the appearance of theatre studios on the base of state culture institution. It is not a question about any independent theatre practice, because the definition of independence is very problematic for the Soviet context. But there was a space of amateur or student theatre. There was the required technical equipment, a space for productions, and even the possibility of young people working here legally and with a salary. The 1960s was a unique time when the idea of left art from the Russia avant-garde period came back and became a part of artistic discourse. Those artists belonging to art informal movement or underground skin, as Russian researcher Lyoля Kantor-Kazovskaya notes, quote, called themselves left artists, unquote. That was a gesture to Russia avant-garde. Paradoxically, on the one hand, most of these artists did not believe in the communism era for coming within 20 years as the party promised. On the other hand, cultural revolution as the idea of Russian avant-garde became the main goal for many left artists of the Thaw period. Many of those whom the system wrote down as dissidents did not consider themselves as such, but by the late 1960s. Russian writer and poet Henryk Sapkir recalls, quote, "Until a certain point we were just poets, And in 1968, when tanks entered Prague, we became unofficial literature. Vladimir Balabokhin, the student of the second degree of Theatre Directorship Department in Theatre and Art Institute in Minsk, was such poet. In 1963, he organized the Junost studio, based in the Palace of Railway Workers. Balabokhin called himself as a left artist, inspired by Brecht's and Meyerhold's ideas. He associated around him a group of like-minded people who dreamed together about own theatre. His personality was a center. His actors told that he was a nerve, he had a great vital energy, he was a writer. Some facts from his biography. Balabokhin was born in 1942 in Petropavlovsk-Kamchatsky in Kamchatka. His father perished in the Second World War before his death. His mother was a doctor and he was sent into workers' camp because a general died in the hospital where she worked. Balabokhin grew up in a children's home. In 1962, he entered to GITIS in Moscow. It did not sit the exams. There, the professors from Belarusian Theatre and Art Institute met him and invited to Minsk to the Theatre Directorship Department. Balabokhin came to Minsk. In the institute, he started to rehearse the test production of his future studio. The play written by Balabokhin was called Beach, a tragic joke in 3 acts with 2 intermezzos and prologue. From Russia, beach means high art to a person. The premiere happened in the Palace of Pioneers, and soon Balabokhin found a space in the Palace of Railway Workers, which became a base for the Junost studio for almost 5 years. Junost was an official title by own members, called it Beach and themselves as Beachy. The main goal of the studio was creation of new theatre art. From the statute of the studio you can read a piece. It was a whole organization. Everybody could become a member. The key conditions were that a potential member should burn with the desire to build new theatre and share the main principle. Quote, "It is not even a matter whether the performances were successful or not successful. It was an environment that was capable of giving birth to their own children." Unquote. Every 2 months, studio's members gathered for general meetings where they had to speak about the work of the studio, about their comrades, and do it openly. Quote, "Discipline must be conscious." Unquote. Privately, such discussions about others were excluded. Everybody should have his or her own opinions. About 50 people passed for the studio, many of whom later became actors, artists, cinema directors, playwrights, composers. In the studio, Balabokhin staged Divine Comedy by Stock, Hamlet by Shakespeare, Fear and Mystery of the Third Reich by Brecht, Pictures from the Insect's Life by Brothers Chapek, Baths by Mayakovsky, Antigona by Anouilh. In order to understand why I was so amazed by such repertoire, you should understand the theatre landscape in Soviet Belarus at that period. There were almost only Soviet ideological plays on the theatre, and because of 20 years of Stalin regime, all memory about any avant-gardists of 1920s was totally demolished. Balabokhin created performances with improvisations method, inspiring actors to participate in the process. They read notes by actors Mikhail Chekhov, using in practice his exercises. Balabokhin wrote his scripts for performances. For example, in Baths, he used the original play with the poems of Mayakovsky, which were excluded by Soviet censorship. Quote, "It was Mayakovsky's sick private poems," told Valery Shushkevich. "The performance was a satire on Soviet reality," unquote. Stage designer and director Vladimir Matrosov notes that these performances was important to them, not just as, well, we say, we made the bus. Quote, "We already understood what was the matter," says Matrosov. "It was Mayakovsky's resistance. Many people died, and for what?" Unquote. Repressions did not bypass Matrosov's family. His grandfather was repressed, and after the Second World War, his father, a Soviet officer, was also sent to a camp. According to Matrosov, all performances of the studio had anti-Soviet messages. One of the important parts of the studio was its educational aspect. Inspired by the ideas of the studio movement of the early 20th century and Meyerhold biomechanics, Balabokhin saw an actor as a universal person. He made lectures about philosophy, history and art. For example, they read and discussed Nietzsche, who was totally forbidden at the moment, philosophy by Plato, Aristotle and Schopenhauer. It is not surprising that very soon the studio attracted the attention of the special security services. The KGB called it as the studio of eggheads. Thus, Valery Shushkevich later found out that for each member of the studio, KGB made a special folder. Vladimir Balabokhin himself was a universal person. He staged performances, taught and wrote novels and plays from his notebooks. You can also read. The scenarios of the films Michelangelo, John Reed, Heroes of the Paris Commune were completed. There were a large number of unfinished manuscripts. In 1967, he began rehearsing the play The Catcher in the Rye by Salinger and did not finish. He had to leave the institute and went to Leningrad. According to Matrosov, Balabokhin did not want to pass the state examination for Marxism-Leninism and had problems. It is known that at the time of study, the professors knew about studio very well and highly appreciated Balabokhin's directing experiments. But it is possible that the institute administration got the information about the close attention to the studio, quote, as a dissident movement, unquote, and they should react. Quote, most likely the non-passed examination was only a reason, unquote. From Leningrad he wrote letters to his studio's friends, he continued to write scripts and dreamed about cinema. In 1970s he perished in Dagestan during the film shooting where he worked as a productive assistant. He was buried in Dagestan. The performances of the studio showed in schools and Palace of Culture, but as the studio members note, mostly it was a place for no strangers. Perhaps the fact that the studio was in the space between repertoire and amateur theatres allowed them to avoid total control. They could stage what they wanted and used the plays which could not be performed by state theatres. The Junost studio did not exist in public discourse, but at the same time it was elusive for censorship. The marginal position of the studio made possible its existence. After Balabokhin left the studio, for a moment the activity was stopped, until Vladimir Matrosov decided to take the leadership in his hand. In November 1968, he made a performance, Waiting for Godot, by Samuel Beckett. This production has also a unique story. There was a scandal with the local authority and an attempt to close the studio. But next year, Matrosov staged the performance based on a feast in Time of Plague by Pushkin. It was the last production of the studio. It was clear that without Balabokhin, the studio could not exist. In addition, the courses of life of members had dispersed. Moving to conclusion. According to German philosopher Martin Puchner, Manifesto plays an extremely important part in the avant-garde. He argues that the genre origin dates back to the Communist Manifesto by Marx and Engels, where poetry of revolution was invented. Describing Marx and Engels' manifesto as a literature work, Puchner sees an immediate connection between its geographical distribution and the map of European and later non-European avant-garde. Puchner notes that manifestos not only denote, quote, symptoms of social change, unquote, but also, quote, moments of actual intervention, unquote. Tomasz Pospisil, an art historian based in Prague, describing the manifestos of neo-avant-garde artists, writes that, quote, these manifestos were not only programmatic proclamations, they also acted as a realization of these programs. Junost studio did not manifest itself. It had a statute, but this document mostly operated by discipline practices. There was no aesthetic program or description of new theatre they dreamed of. Nevertheless, Junost became more than a theatre studio, setting itself the task of creating a specific environment, the type of organization with meetings, active participation, self-criticism. These principles refer to the phenomenon of Soviet collective as it's described by Russian theorist Oleg Kharkordin. According to him, such a collective is characterized by, quote, horizontal supervision among equals in status, unquote, realized through, quote, conviction of sins, camaraderie, admonition, and excommunication, unquote. On the one hand, Kharkordin notes that including in the dissident circles of the 1960s, quote, mutual supervision was practiced to keep ideals alternative to official, but often no less dogmatic, unquote. But on the other hand, just during the war period, various types of collectives began to appear, secret groups, unofficial clubs, various subcultures, representing more or less stable networks of close friends, which was not typical of the form of the collective which cultivated by the Soviet ideology. Analyzing the background practices of the Soviet society, Kharkordin argues that individualization, which is traditionally associated with democratic societies, was already formed within the framework of the Soviet collective, especially in its informal forms when self-improvement was one of the basic principles of individualism. The story of a Junost today is an example of such a new form of collective. Its statute proclaimed that identity of a person is the most important and that at the same time a collective is more important than private life. In addition, there was implicit submission to the will of the director. Thus, the statute shows that Junost was just a test attempt to transgress the boundaries of a Soviet collective, to mark a space for new types of social relation in the frame of the Soviet system. They tried to become as a community, about which Russia cultural science Elena Petrovskaya writes as an experience, quote, not belonging to anyone and immediately revealing a community, unquote. She states that the avant-garde, quote, in its original historical form is closely connected with social transformation, unquote, and represents the extreme experience. Quote, avant-garde art maps out this new community and thus outperforms the forms which should fix these new social forms at institutional level, unquote. For various internal and external reasons, in Junost studio this attempt failed and the community which was held up on Bolobokhin's personality did not happen. Apparently, its time in this place has not yet come. In conclusion, there are several important reasons to analyze this practice in terms of the avant-garde, in my opinion. Firstly, by this way, Belarusian cultural landscape gets back to the narrative of avant-garde, which in the 1910s, 1920s, in its geography was directly connected to this territory. Secondly, it allows us to counter the cliché of Belarus as a homogeneous cultural field as we focusing on differences. Thirdly, the definition of Belarusian local version of avant-garde is a part of the debate of rethinking this phenomenon in general. American cultural theorist James Elkins observes, quote, we are still avant-garde's prisoners, so it is worth the effort to find a legitimate avant-garde which would be able to hypnotize us, unquote. He suggests returning to the philosophical understanding of the avant-garde, focusing not on the universal aesthetic criteria, but on what manifests itself at the time of the discovery of differences. In this case, it is not, as Elkins argues, about the adaptation of the existing concept, which would provide a new framework for interpreting the avant-garde as a multiply phenomenon, but about what the theorist calls, quote, evading from the Western interpretation strategies, unquote. Not only in a radical different cultural context, but also in the context where these differences are not so obvious, especially in boundary or transition areas, which is often the reason why these territories are excluded. And the last slides, some words, because last Monday in Minsk, in Museum of Theatre and Music Culture, we opened the exhibition devoted 50 years of Waiting for Godot performance and 55 years of the Junost studio, because 5 members are still alive. And it's very symbolic gesture, I guess, and I hope that some artifacts and posters will become a part of this permanent exhibition, because we still have this history of Belarusian theater of 20 years, like from Soviet time. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Tania. And now we are going to continue with Martynas Petrikas and Asta Petrikienė. And they are from Vilnius, Lithuania. And Martynas is working for the Faculty of Communication, Vilnius University, and Asta is working for the Vilnius Technical University. And they are going to present their paper together, and they are going to share the floor themselves. And they are going to talk about autonomous future/future of autonomy. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Zoltan, for introduction. Good morning, everyone. So the name of Antanas Sutkus, very known figure for those in the project, and an actor, director, pedagogue, and theoretician of stage art to the others, is associated with 2 theaters operating in interwar period in Lithuania, Kaunas. The Nation Theatre, well, not to be confused with National Theatre, yeah, and the Werewolf. Werewolf in Lithuanian is Vilkolakis, in Polish Wilkołak, tak? Was an artistic club turned into cabaret, turned into theatre of satire. So both theatres functioned as private enterprises for most of their time. At the Nation Theatre, Sutkus tried to implement his vision of Lithuanian theatre and its particular spiritual style. It was intended as a highbrow theatre project. But in this paper, we'll focus on the Werewolf, another part of Sutkus' theatre program that functioned as place for satire, thus balancing and complementing the metaphysical aspirations of the nation's theatre. Prototype for the Werewolf were the artistic cabarets and miniature theatres that began to spread in Europe in the 19th century. In Russia, these genres appeared at the beginning of the 20th century, and they functioned in closed artistic clubs, as well as on commercial stages. The novelty and exceptional flexibility of both forms have created favorable conditions for creative experiments. The Werewolf, also founded as a semi-exclusive bohemian club, continued the pre-World War I traditions in terms of structure and form, and in the years of 1920-1925 was an important place on the theatre map of Lithuania. This picture documents the meeting where Antanas Sutkus becomes a leader of the Werewolf. So from the very beginning, the Werewolf, which around 1921 became a satire theatre, was an alternative scene. First of all, it was a completely private institution, operating without the support of the authorities, and as such was in no way dependent on the official ideology. Secondly, the modest premises of the theatre contrasted with the appearance of the constantly perfected state theatre, and had underground conspirational character to its soirees. The soirees were played several times a month. In the period when the Werewolf functioned as a cabaret, a mixed program was presented, consisting of improvisations, short intermedia, humorous monologues, etc. And when it became a theater of satire, then 1 or 2 longer performances were staged. The shows and their genres were usually called in a rather funny manner. For example, a 3-part grimace operetta, The Dollar Prince, and the 3-part harsh engagement, The Burdocks. Social criticism of the werewolf was present in both cabaret and satirical theater periods. In the first case, numbers such as Veronica News, Confused News, and the popular Chorus of Giants, which looked like this, were funnily commenting on the most recent social and political events. After the werewolf turned into a theater of satire, the critique became more developed, and it was constantly created, and it was based on collectively created scenarios and short plays. Most of the productions were one-off spectacles, only longer performances were repeated. The werewolf also functioned as an experimental studio. Same actors played the werewolf and in Nations Theatre. Same company operated in parallel ways, the artists aiming to synthesize different arts, to avoid specializations in terms of emploi, and to implement modern notions of theatre making, such as visuality, improvisation, etc. The actors of the werewolf have to learn to improvise and thus to transgress the authority of the author. Satirical performances had to trigger the individual potential for improvisation, creative transformation, and awareness of the body as an instrument for communicating ideas. Expressive, grotesque performances at the werewolf expressed Sutkus's idea of theatricality as opposed to text-based theatre. In contrast to the mainstream, the productions of the werewolf never attempted to present the illusion of reality. The actors never identified with the characters in terms of psychological identification. A variety of themes and issues were satirized. Political events, example, elections to the parliaments, were mocked alongside everyday customs of increasingly Europeanized Lithuanian bourgeoisie. The prototypes appearing in performances were not difficult to recognize. Growing popularity of the theatre, the werewolf toured into the provinces, and politically sharp topics turned into a problem for the government. The last performance, called The Musketeers, criticized the military school and thus touched upon the affairs of the Ministry of National Defense. The show was banned, and the werewolf soon lost its premises in Kaunas and ceased operations altogether. So, is there any kind of lesson of transferable knowledge that could be regarded as an experience that avant-gardists of the future could, or indeed have built upon? We propose 3 bullet points, and now Martynas is taking over.
Yes, I do. It's very curious that the composition of this panel began to dwell on the idea of a studio. So the thing that we are presented is a studio, in terms that it's a studio and a theater at simultaneous time. Sutkus, that Asta mentioned, was a graduate of yet another studio himself. These ideas that he was trying to develop, his company in 20s and the 30s, were brought down from Moscow, where he studied under Fyodor Komisarzeski before and during World War I. So the studios, as we can see, well, they do become the possibility of being in the world differently, of different being in the world. Right, so our 3 bullet points that we propose as the to reflect upon as something that was established in the 20s and the 30s and was potentially traveled after World War I and was realized by another generations of the avant-garde or post-avant-garde artists. Right, so our first bullet point. As we could see, Sutkus and his company had to invent new organizational forms in order to survive and to create. Lack of financial support had to be compensated by manifold movements. On one hand, Sutkus and company reached to the market, providing audience with an entertainment. Choosing highly volatile genre of satire, Sutkus and company nevertheless counted on its subversive rather than fiscal potential. On the other hand, the artists clearly attempted to facilitate their existence by inventing effective internal forms of cooperation. And on third, symbolic hand, if you wish, Sutkus and company contributed to introduction of alternative in terms of economical, creative, and subsequently political arrangement of being in the world. It remains debatable of how consciously it was done, yet from our point of view, introduction of an alternative field into the field of perception is the most avant-garde and most transferable aspect of Sutkus's project. So it's an introduction of alternative into a field of perception. Let us then take a closer look. Let us assume, dwelling on Jacques Rancière rather loosely, that by its very presence, the autonomy provides a great possibility to change its immediate environment. Technically, Sutkus's project was created autonomous by refusing public funds, thus cutting it loose from the system of official support. As the project survived, Sutkus and company had clearly invested into alternative forms of labor organization, division, and remuneration. The key word here, and I guess it's for the first time in this conference, that begs to be acknowledged, is collective creation, which apparently allowed to neutralize negative finances, yet also provided everyone with equal opportunity to author. I quote, "It would often happen that the initial scenario, due to creative will and circumstances of the artists, would turn into entirely new one in terms of both form and content." End of quote. In this picture, that's different. Yeah. In this picture, you can see the company members discussing a scenario. It's a documented moment of collective creation, if you wish. As we all know very well, with a little help of Theodor Shank, of course, the principles of creative creation were broadly applied in post-World War I Europe and the US. The collective creation became a designate not only for solution to counterfight a financial misery, but also for alternative being in the world. As Milo Rao announced a couple of weeks ago at another conference in Paris, we should think of the idea of an author as of a bourgeois concept. Thus, rejection of it in favor of multiple authorship equals to creation of autonomous environment for alternative creative existence. Which leads us to our point 2. Principle of collective creation that Sutkus's company was rested upon provided its audience with productions that underlined unorthodox ways of being in the world. I will focus on precarious existence in terms of economics and gender. From what Asta told us earlier, soirees as a werewolf aimed to shock the audience with clearly exposed material meagerness of the production and of its consumption. This is the audience at the Werewolf during one of the surveys. I especially like this one. He seems clearly shocked. Well, so these are the meager material conditions of production and of its consumption. In the context of growing grandeur of the state theater, which was the biggest institution in Kaunas, the state-owned and supported institution, the Werewolf was nothing but opposite. The audience had to suffer from the outset. The premises were too small, unaccommodating, poorly lit, and ventilated since everyone smoked. Some attendees had to stand through the run, as you can see in the back. Yet the biggest challenge awaited on the stage. The offenses were numerous. Famous orchestra that was used, it was composed out of broken bottles, tin cans, household things, as well as actor voices that were all imitating sounds of music. Oral discomfort was extended further by visuals. The Werewolf rejected realist convention, favoring theatricality, and dwelt on grotesque distortions and showcasing of theatrical mechanisms. As if the shape of the world that the audience was invited to experience was intended as a stark contrast to pleasantries and beauties of the lifestyle envisaged by the capitalist regime. The werewolf world was not at all conventionally rewarding. This is Wilsonesque, isn't it? The werewolf world was not at all conventionally rewarding. Thus, the norms of success inherent to modern societies was symbolically transgressed. Dwelling on unorthodox representation further, the production called the ballet deserves our attention. The cross-dressing was a frequent feature of the werewolf productions. Full or partial drag was often used to create a comic effect, but to our minds, the ballet could be considered one of the early examples of unorthodox representation of gender that could have been used as a pointer to instability of gender norms. The inspiration for the ballet was a transgression itself. Some of the werewolf artists intended to satirize low professionalism of the state ballet and its étoile. However, behind the production, composed out of men in drag and regularly dressed females that stood as a corps de ballet and everything ran under Tchaikovsky's music, several pointers to the norms clearly loomed. Thus, in the ballet, the artist transgressed the norms of art and gender and their representation, and by the same token pointed to the existence of such norms and to their instability. Again, as we know very well, theatrical deterritorialization of gender representation alongside performative deflation of the mainstream societal systems were the features that post-avant-garde theaters were actively building upon after World War II. Let us just think of famous examples of the performance group or the Wooster group, or indeed of the collectives founded more recently during their studies at the Applied Theater Studies in Gießen, the GOP Squad, Shishi Pop, Monster Truck, and others. Which leads us to the point 3. Characteristically for avant-garde projects, the werewolf believed in direct ties linking art and the world. Ideas of inseparability, mutual influence, and amelioration manifested itself in their performances and other activities such as publishing, public lectures, and tours around Lithuania that the werewolf was organizing regularly. In Sutka's words, some people believed that the theater was a political party aiming to win next elections and to govern the country. In our points 1 and 2, we try to show that the werewolf strategy was rested upon creative effect that after many years, Rancia called the senses. Statkus and company were painstakingly inventing and sustaining autonomy of their project, at the same time envisaging the change in condition in their immediate reality. The autonomy of the werewolf was based on practices of transgression, deterritorialization, and border crossing on economical, creative, and aesthetic level. On one hand, the werewolf provided its audiences with destabilizing visions of the world, yet on another, the company symbolically embodied the alternative. That is, the alternative way of being within the same world as the rest of the society. Hence, the werewolf became a practice of transgressing the borders between art and life that usually comes at a high cost and thus is not viable in the framework of conventional understanding of functionality. This way, the werewolf's art and lifestyle of its makers created a potential dissensus, that is, disruption, that paves the way for the new forms of being and experiencing the world. The aim here, as Rancia reminds us, is not an institutional overturn of the factual present, but introduction of, I quote, new subjects and heterogeneous objects into the field of perception, end of quote. Statkus himself did not consider the werewolf to be radical. In his own wording, telling the truth, creating a conscious citizen's contribution for amelioration of everyday gloom were the most important objectives. From the perspective of the 21st century, they see that contemporary artistic practices exercising the power to open new perspectives often dwell on the same strategies of creating the senses by transgressing norms and by embodying the transgression. We thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. And our third presenter is Karolina Czerska. She's working for the Department of Romance Studies and at the same time the Center for Avant-Garde Studies at the Jagiellon University in Krakow. And she has just curated an exhibition titled Cricot is Coming at the Cricoteka in Krakow. And she's going to talk about experiments in the Krakow theater, Krakow versus Warsaw.
Thank you very much and good morning. So, experiments in Cricot theater, Krakow versus Warsaw. The activities of the Polish experimental Cricot theater are closely linked to the city of Krakow and its artistic circles. Before the theater's official launch in 1933, its members held a number of rehearsals in Krakow, thus laying the foundations for Cricot's later, more consistent and sustained activity. The history of pre-Cricot dates back to the early 20s, when the Formists, a group of painters, sculptors and writers, forging their own unique style, partly inspired by Cubism, Futurism and Expressionism, were active in Krakow. This radical artistic formation was relatively short-lived. It only lasted about 5 years, but as a result, it remained distinctive and undoubtedly avant-garde in character. Józef Jarema and Zygmunt Waliszewski, two young artists studying painting at the Academy of Fine Arts in Krakow, who a decade later would become the co-creators of Cricot theater, formed a close relationship with the group. The fact that they were of a generation younger than the Formists did not, however, prevent them from discussing art within the Formist circles, thus forging an important link between the pre-Cricot and the avant-garde, which was then active in Krakow. Shortly afterwards, in 1923, the so-called Paris Committee was formed within the student community at the Academy of Fine Arts in Krakow. The group planned a short trip to Paris in order to gain direct access to the highest quality artworks exhibited there. Preparations for the trip lasted 1 year. Committee members raised funds for the journey and the stay itself. As part of this effort, they organized, among other things, raffles, costume balls, and staged several performances based on the dramas of Józef Jarema at the Miejski Theatre, Municipal Theatre, whose management at the time favored new initiatives. The performances were humorous, often based on absurd and grotesque elements. Later, all these actions, even after several years, were still remembered by the then inhabitants of Krakow. It certainly meant that Krakow's artistic landscape took on new colors for at least a few months, the colors of youth and spontaneous artistic playfulness. The stay in Paris, instead of a few months, lasted several years. At the start of the 30s, the Kapists, members of the Paris Committee, eventually returned to Poland. In France, they performed several theatrical plays on small cafe stages, among others Jarema's dramas in both Polish and French. But this had little to do with the consistently developed theatrical concept. Instead, they focused on painting and visiting museums. An unusual turn took place. The young artists from the Krakow Academy were interested in classical painting and regularly visited the Louvre collections, disregarding the latest trends in art presented at the time in Paris. This was a result of a gap that appeared when the formist Avant-Garde group was dissolved, and the young painters, still full of unspent creative energy, met Józef Pankiewicz, a professor at the Academy. Pankiewicz introduced them to post-impressionist colorist painting before they left for France. Later, he showed the Kapists around the Louvre, and his input constituted the main lesson in art history learned by the Kapists in the French capital. These intertwined links between the young painters and various artistic trends, formist, traditional, and academic, would have a huge impact on the future character of Cricot. It is, however, difficult to classify Cricot as a truly avant-garde theatre. Its collaborators included artists with often extremely different artistic visions, radical, avant-garde, and even conservative. This diversity was characteristic of the 20s and 30s Krakow, and Cricot grew out of this very diversity. Eventually, Cricot became a fixture on the city's artistic landscape, inextricably linked with two places in Krakow. In 1933, it began performing at the Artists' House, Dom Artystów, the then seat of the Professional Association of Polish Artists and Designers. It was not a professional theatre with a real stage, but a small space on the first floor of a building next to the Municipal Theatre. In 1935, Cricot, alongside the association, moved to the House of Fine Artists, Dom Plastyków, at Łobzowska Street, a newly constructed modernist building. Specifically, Cricot used its cafe space equipped with a small stage. Both of Cricot's headquarters were simultaneously places where Krakow's intelligentsia, not just the artistic community, but also lawyers and doctors, met and held discussions. It is worth noting that the cafe at the House of Fine Artists, also known as the Red Cafe, became the most popular meeting point for Krakow's left-wing and communist circles. This was directly related to Cricot's activities, as the theatre's permanent collaborators included artists belonging to the left-wing Krakow group, an avant-garde formation of painters and sculptors that included Henryk Wiciński, Maria Jarema, Jonasz Stern, and Adam Marczyński. They were responsible for Cricot's most avant-garde performances. Left-wing writers, such as Adam Polewka, the creator of the puppet theatre aimed at the working class, and a writer, Lech Piwowar, also cooperated with the theatre. This political dimension is significant in the context of Cricot's reception in Krakow. The artistic value of Cricot's different productions varied widely. A detailed analysis of particular performances reveals that some were characterized by extremely high quality, while others introduced very interesting singular concepts that did not translate into a well-considered, rounded character of the work. Most frequently, accusations concerned technical deficiencies, most often related to the lack of funds or the rush accompanying the creation of performances, and amateurism. While Cricot was co-created by professional artists, mostly painters, the actors were amateurs and often the painters themselves performed on stage. Only a few characters associated with professional theatre were active in Cricot. These included the actor and director Władysław Woźnik and director Władysław Krzemiński. Among Krakow's local newspaper reviewers, one can distinguish both keen supporters and opponents of Cricot's work. Some noticed Cricot's deficiencies, but were also able to appreciate the value of its work. Mojżesz Kanfer, for example, described individual performances drawing attention to both strengths and shortcomings, and in conclusion stated that, quote, "The last premiere of a pleasant experimental theatre is a serious step forward in the search for new theatrical forms. While it still resembles a parlour game, the theatre has already reached the finish line, where theatre really begins." End of quote. However, significant differences in the tone of reviews were largely related to the existence of two hostile camps. Krakow's politics and news daily, the illustrated daily Kurier, Ilustrowany Kurier Codzienny, was close to the circles favoring conservative professors of the Academy of Fine Arts. Articles appearing in this newspaper focused, on the one hand, on direct criticism of the Cricot theatre. One of the reviewers called it a theatre of a different race, understandably arousing controversy, and on the other hand, on the extra-theatrical activity of its members. In 1934, a famed dispute concerning the reconstruction of the royal castle on Wawel played out in the press. A competition was officially announced, but contrary to the expectations of the conservative milieu, the committee chose young painters, including Józef Jarema and Zygmunt Waliszewski. The illustrated daily Kurier wrote that the committee should have chosen Polish artists instead. And here it is worth noting that Jarema was born in Stary Sambor, a town currently and previously located in the Ukraine, and Waliszewski was born in St. Petersburg. In a sharp polemic, Jarema responded to numerous accusations of the Kurier's authors. However, there was no black and white division in the local press when it came to the reception of Cricot's activities. It is also worth noting that the conservative daily Czas, Time, treated Cricot rather favorably. It regularly published mostly positive reviews, as well as announcements of subsequent premieres and performances. It is worth remembering that the official inauguration of Cricot took place in autumn of 1933, and it happened with that very production based on Jarema's drama. By the spring of 1934, the theatre already had a few successes, performances that were very well received by at least some critics and the audience. At this point, Cricot decided to present its concept of new theatre in the capital of Poland, and there was a perfect opportunity to do so. In March of 1934, an exhibition of the copyist's work was to be opened in Warsaw at the Institute of Art Propaganda. Then Cricot presented, among others, The Death of a Faun by Tytus Różewski, Witkiewicz's Cuttlefish, and stage productions of Jarema's surrealist leaning dramas. Some critics and viewers treated Cricot's arrival with curiosity and sympathy. It seemed to have brought a breath of fresh air and some new quality, quite different to the plays that Warsaw's theatre-goers were used to seeing. One reviewer, in an article entitled "The World Upside Down," wrote, quote, "Now Cricot appears in front of Warsaw's audience and takes a look at this stranger, this pleasant stranger. It gazes at her lips and behaves as I have always done, approaches her with an elegant gesture." End of quote. another journalist, Henryk Liński, wrote, quote, Jarema's sketch, Miss Agnieszka's Heart, does not make much sense, however it was not that nonsensical, and in terms of acting, despite primitive means, it was perfectly executed. The fiancé and the performer in the title role of Miss Osterwianka were particularly phenomenal. Tytus Tchórzewski's stage poem, The Death of the Faun, although it might be a fault in this case, was entirely understandable and truly interesting. While it should not be a complaint, the performers could easily show it in the so-called official theatre, because they played impeccably and their grotesques had a strong pitch and colouring. End of quote. Soon after, the same reviewer published a separate article devoted to an exceptional member of the group, Jacek Puszet, a capist schooled in sculpture, figurative and classical, who while in Cricot became a true dance star. He did not have any education in this field and performed grotesque, bizarre dance routines to his own choreography, while wearing humorous costumes, a bull as a rooster, as a Spanish lady, and with unusual accessories, like his famous dance with the broom. So I think we have another famous broom in the Polish theatre. Meanwhile, Tadeusz Breza, a writer, essayist, and recognized reviewer, wrote about the same performances in a completely different tone. The title of his article revealed his views on Cricot. Friendly nonsense asks to take the floor, Krakow's Cricot. He noted, quote, what is this Cricot about? Miss Agnieszka's Heart, written by Jarema, is frankly a monstrous malarkey. They enter, bang on the walls, leave, carry something out, squeak, march, bend, and so on. An ill-tempered viewer is cursing and swearing, or is sad because he feels tricked. A mischievous viewer is roaring with laughter. The show is quite hermetic, a hermetic sense of humor, seemingly a grotesque. Seemingly there is some sense here, but after a while, everything bursts into a complete nonsense. End of quote. On Jacek Puszet's dances, he continued sarcastically, quote, these are modern dance performances. A scruffy, semi-naked man with a pathetic, De Chirico-like face comes onto the stage wearing red stockings and begins to contort his arms, legs, and his entire body. End of quote. An idea gradually occurred to Jarema that once Cricot established a position for itself within the Krakow artistic community, it would set off to conquer Warsaw. Possibly it was Jarema's brother, Władysław, who after World War II founded Groteska Theatre in Krakow, that contributed to the implementation of this idea. At the time, Władysław lived in the capital, as did Roman, another one of Jarema's siblings. Roman was not part of the art world and did not get involved with Cricot while Władysław did, but he made part of his Warsaw apartment available as Cricot's temporary technical facilities. An existing letter from 1938, signed by Józef and Władysław Jarema, addressed the Institute of Art Propaganda with a request to establish a Warsaw branch of the Cricot. Most probably, the brothers did not envisage a break with Krakow and an irrevocable move to Warsaw, but rather planned on parallel activities in both cities. As a result, however, the final season of Cricot's activity, 1938-1939, consisted mainly of performances in Warsaw. It was announced in Krakow's artistic press, where Józef Jarema published two texts ahead of Cricot's new season and The Will of Artistic Theatre. Jarema stated that following a period of, quote, protest, outcry, and experimental negation of what was happening and still happens in the sanctuaries of theatre, Cricot entered a positive period of stage work, end of quote. He also wrote about, quote, a new will of contemporary artists, the will to establish a new, truly artistic theatre, end of quote. Apparently, all that was to be presented in its fully developed form in Warsaw. In March of 1939, an anonymous reviewer of the opinion-forming conservative daily Słowo, Word, published in Vilnius, wrote about Cricot's successful attempt to conquer the capricious Madame la Varsovie. Quote, "Almost half a year has passed since this youthful southern breeze, Cricot arriving from Krakow, refreshed the stuffy courtyard of theatrical Warsaw." And quote again, "Cricot won over the sentiments of the audience, but also the indifferent hearts of the reviewers." End of quote. If this was the case, it was thanks to the successful production previously shown in front of Krakow's audiences, such as Pergolesi's Baroque opera La Serva Padrona with Waliszewski costumes, Wyspiański's experimental staging of Liberation directed by the theatrical professional Woźnik, who also played the main role, or the farce of Master Patelin, based on an old French text in an excellent Polish language version by Adam Polewka, with Tadeusz Piotr Potworowski's scenography. Patelin was shown almost 50 times in Warsaw, which proves its great success and high attendance. But, as Leon Chwistek, an eminent philosopher, mathematician and formist painter, mentioned yesterday by Dariusz Kosiński, so you could see the reproduction of one of his famous paintings, formist ones. And actually, if you're interested, his writings were translated into English and published last year. It's very interesting. So he pointed out in January of 1939, quote, "Jarema shows Patelin in Warsaw simply because he is afraid to stage his own plays. A lot is required of the theatre in Warsaw, and the level of criticism is extremely high. I would never dare to engage in a substantive discussion on this subject because I would most certainly be defeated. But I think that maybe a straightforward artistic reaction is also worth something, and maybe it should not always be suppressed for fear of being accused of ignorance." End of quote. Perhaps this very opinion motivated Jarema to create a separate experimental program for Cricot, and I quote from Jarema's handwritten notes. "It aimed, on the one hand, at attempting new theatrical forms and, on the other, at demonstrating the unknown, never-before staged plays to people with a deeper interest in dramatists. An exposé by the producers, stage managers and their artistic collaborators would precede each staging of a new play, followed by a discussion with the participation of the artists, critics, as well as the audience. Cricot's management has great hopes for such theatrical evenings, which will hopefully provide a starting point for new ideas, for arousing interest and a theatrical movement, and eventually for the expansion of the modest Polish theatre studies, and overcoming shortcomings in the field of the theatre's artistic issues, for which Cricot, in this way, opens a wide field for discussion." End of quote. Unfortunately, the only attempt in this experimental series shown in Warsaw was Triangle and Circle, produced by Henryk Wiciński and based on The Mute Canary by the French Dadaist Georges Rimbaud Desaigne. In 1935, Cricot staged The Mute Canary in Krakow. At the time, the reviewers praised Maria Jarema's costumes. And these are not from The Mute Canary, but it's still Maria Jarema's sketches, so I think it's interesting that you could take a look on that. The Warsaw performance in the new version was quite radical, with a mobile stage design. The actors performed almost acrobatic movements, and during rehearsals, they focused on voice training and body awareness. As planned, the performance was preceded by Wiciński's commentary. A lively discussion, which later continued at the Polish Writers' Trade Union, took place after the show. The reaction of Warsaw's press, which I cannot discuss here at length because of limited time, was quite interesting. Wojciech Natanson, the writer and theatre critic, described the entire situation as a small theatrical war. Quote, "And yet, Cricot has already become an institution that plays a modest but important role in the life of Warsaw and Poland. It is, in terms of acting and theory, an imperfect theatre. Who would dare to contradict this. The leaders of Cricot do not claim they want to surpass Jaracz or Osterwa. And yet, Cricot's modest efforts are often the nucleus of entirely new energies. This is how the Old Vic theatre began in England, and this is how Copeau, Dulin, Betty and Jouvet's theatres emerged in France. Today, again, Paris has an entire legion, supposedly several dozen, of small, half-amateur theatres. End of quote. This opinion was later confirmed by Leon Chwistek, quote, "No one wishes to claim that Cricot's actors are on the same level as the great dramatic arts in Warsaw, or that they wish to compete with that. It seems, however, that if there ever was in Poland a moment truly favorable to an escape from theatrical route without eccentricity, frustration and a wretched fear of dissolution of everyday life, it has never been this clear. There have never been innovations this grounded, this rational." End of quote. It should be noted, however, that The Triangle and Circle was the only new play produced by Cricot in Warsaw. In the summer, a new performance of the satirical show was staged, but it was a series of sketches rather than the performance based on a new drama, as Cricot's experimental program had announced. The rehearsals for Faust, based on Ribmond de Sain's text, began, but the outbreak of World War II thwarted the theatre's plans. It is therefore not known in which direction Cricot would have turned to in the future. Thank you very much.
So, thank you very much for these very interesting lectures. And could you please come to the floor and take responsibility what you have done so far? And now we need. Yeah, it's okay.
I think we're fine with the chairs. No?
Just one enough. So, question time.
Really?
Any questions from the audience? Don't be shy. Okay. Vice?
Thank you all. It's a very interesting panel. I have a question about the census, I think, to start with. It seemed with Werewolf this exciting, very queer, potentially way of imagining or reimagining ways of living in a collective. And I've been reading a lot recently. Duško Radoslavievich is doing a project about shared authorship or multivocal authorship in theater making, and is also looking at different historical forms. And one of the questions I know that keeps coming up for her is about the abdication of responsibility, that when something becomes shared, what happens to forms of responsibility in relationship to questions of authorship and ethics of practice. So on the one hand, I would be curious about that. And on the other hand, I was wondering, when I think, Martynas, you said about looking at Rancière, that this question of the census says that there are heterogeneous objects that come into our field of perception. And I'm curious about the relationship between object and subject here. It seemed to me some of the things that you were describing in Werewolf's practice was about new forms of subjectivity become available to our field of perception. So what are the heterogeneous objects that come into our field of perception through this practice, I would say? Or do you find a tension between object, subject?
Exactly.
As well?
Well, thank you very much. I'll begin with the object. I actually now feel sorry that I didn't include another image from the werewolf. There's this very curious overlapping of subject and object thing going on in the werewolf, where actors at some of those productions are being dressed up in that way that they are losing human forms. The most simple trick to achieve that effect was the used masks. I mean, very plastic masks in terms of Venetian style that actually distorts the features of the face, and then they would be dressed in the costumes that would be either ill-fitting or too tailored, very geometric. So sometimes I get this idea of losing those human forms and turning into object, maybe something like that was there. Therefore, I thought that it's curious to reflect on that. Coming to the shared responsibility and losing the focus. Well, we always have this issue of, well, there's always this issue, but judging by the memoirs or the attempts that the company made, I would ask a question whether they're aware about such kind of an issue. In terms of theorizing, I'd say that we're too naive to think about the losing of responsibility. Their collective attempt was simply to ameliorate the situation that they thought needs to be ameliorated in terms of making art, creating conditions for the ethical, if you wish, living in the world, and pointing and presenting it in this shocking way or rather shocking way to the audience.
If I may ask,
of course.
But legally, Antanas Sutkus was responsible, yes, because
yes,
he was.
Yeah, that's the point. Yes, yes.
And when the company was banned, when the werewolf was banned,
exactly,
due to the scandal with Ministry of National Defense, then Antanas Sutkus had to leave Kaunas for some years.
Yes, that's right.
So legally, he was the one who had to take this responsibility.
He was the one to blame of everything.
Blame,
yes, yeah. Technically speaking, because well, he always said that. Well, I'm a sort of a leader, but I'm not the leading leader or something like that.
But someone had to put
the signatures and everything. He was very fluent in how do you call it, accounting. So he was always taking care about the financial matters and things like that.
Later on, he was the head of State Theatre, and later on, he was the head of a radio station.
Which is another curious twist. When the werewolf was banned and they lost their premises and they ceased the operations, Sutkus was immediately invited to become a general manager of State Theatre.
In several years, several months.
Well, the years, as a matter of fact.
Several years.
Yes, that's right.
To be precise.
To be precise. But that was due to the parliamentary elections, since for a couple of years in Lithuania we had a centrist leftist government. So they wanted Sutkus to head the State Theatre, but everything changed again rather quickly. So it was an interesting thing. But coming back to this responsibility, so yes, legally, Sitkus was the one to blame for everything, but he was really clear about this idea that if actors feel that something needs to be included since it comes from their own experience or their own worldview or something, that has to be in the production, otherwise it's not working and it's not needed.
Thank you. Another question?
Yes, I have a question for Tania, if I may. Could you please say something about possible links between the Junost studio and, if there are any, Belarusian avant-garde of the 1920s? Was there any inspiration between the historical avant-garde and what we tried to achieve? Is one question, and the other one, just a very small one. You said that Boabochin perished in 1970s in Dagestan. What does it mean that he perished? Just died?
May I join to Derek, because I have a similar question to you as well. Thank you for the wonderful presentation. And is there any connections, or are there any connections among, because yesterday we were talking about networking and how these avant-garde circles were connected. And is there any outside or inside connections?
Thank you for the questions. The second one about his biography, because his death was really like, I know, like in film about such kind of person. He worked as a productive assistant, and it was a moment of shooting the film, and suddenly the empty bus started just to fall down, and he tried to save people around, just go and so on, and no, all people were survived, but he personally was died. Yeah, and it's also like, you know, you think, yeah, maybe it's like the end for such kind of person who was somehow in any step before the situation in the society at that time. And the third question, and your question, because actually I told yesterday Dariusz that before I started to analyze this period, I should do a lot of work with this historical backgrounds. Really like 50% of research, I just step by step try to look for some traces, connections, and so on. And the situation was that because of this Stalinism, it is true that people really forgot about any connections with the avant-garde of 20s in this territory. And when it became possible somehow to speak about something new after the Stalin death, left art, avant-garde started to return from Moscow. That's why Mayakovsky, for example, or left artists from Russia avant-garde. But because actually at that moment, a little bit early, after the Second War, one theater director, he was really avant-garde from my perspective during 20s, from let's say Belarusian Yiddish theater. He had very dramatic story during the directing in National Theatre. After this discussion against formalism in theatre and so on. And he was survived, but he started to make like something that it could be possible to do in this situation. And after the Second World War, because there was like the second anti-Yiddish company in Soviet Union and in BSSR, he was removed from National Theatre and but nobody still now remember about that in 20s he was really avant-garde director. Lev Litvinov. And actually Pavlinka, it is like the symbolic performance from National Theatre Janka Kupala. He made it after the Second World War, and he did it. But it was period even during 70s, 80s when his name was like demolished because this Yiddish regions and so on. So and
it's quite interesting that there was a erasal of memory.
Yeah,
in
it's
nearly
true.
all the Eastern European countries.
Even when you speak with alive people, human memory is a strange document. It's really helpful, but every time you should somehow check and understand this cross. And the question about network, it's also interesting because I hoped that maybe somehow, because Poland and Lithuania, we are close, but it's also about political situation. It was really border, even with Poland, and somehow information came, but I guess people were afraid to discuss it and so on.
Thank you.
Thank you for very nice and very interesting papers. And now in the discussion you touched a very, very interesting point. It's what about the conscious amnesia, or something which could be called a loss of memory about the avant-garde, certain aspects of the avant-garde, which I think happened in all Eastern Europe, but not only in Eastern or Central Europe. And the question which I'm asking is, everybody or proposing is, was this amnesia politically motivated, or was it aesthetically motivated, or both? Maybe in some cases, I know that in Slovenia we have this historical avant-garde, and we had a long amnesia about the historical avant-garde, not just Černigov and Delak and the theatrical creators, but also about probably the biggest constructivist poet in Slovenia, Srečko Kosovel, whose poems were published only in 1968, and they were published before in French translation than in Slovene original, which is part of a specific culture and national amnesia. It's not political amnesia of a small country. So it's a topic which is very interesting, which you open now with several cases.
If I may, well, Lithuania might represent an exception and a curious case. We actually, well, from my point of view, I might be wrong, but we do not suffer from the amnesia. We did not, Lithuanian artists did not suffer from amnesia in the 60s or the 70s, quite opposite. There was this huge emphasis on the historical experiences. I mean, all the bits and pieces that were available, magazines or excerpts from the magazines, were collected, cherished, and saying that an inspiration from the 20s and the 30s. In fact, it was an interesting thing that many of the artists have survived. For instance, the Antanas Sutkus that we spoke about, he published his memoirs called The Werewolf Theatre in the 60s. So the pictures there were, everyone could see and everyone could read. Of course, the abundance or the surplus of memories has its own downsides. I mean, what was included into the archive, what was included into the memoir, we don't have any memories of Jewish theater, for instance, from that period, of course not. But, or other things that were going on, for instance, international touring that was taking place in the 20s and the 30s, no one cared about that. No one spoke about that, as a matter of fact. Regardless that some famous people were coming and going. Well, anyway, so I don't feel that Lithuanian artists felt that amnesia at any point, as a matter of fact.
Don't forget that politics became so only practically after the Second World War.
That's right. It's a bit different kind of a situation. I mean, we had this tradition or the germ of a tradition that was longer present than in different other countries. So that's my answer.
And in fact, the werewolf was closed due to political reasons.
Oh,
so
yes.
it was a proper way to remember that independence.
Exactly. Yeah. It was something that could be mentioned.
Yeah,
they were dissidents. Yes, they were dissidents. Destroying the bourgeois kind of a society of the 20s.
In terms of amnesia, what happened to the first
actually,
Krakow
I'd like to say that for me, a kind of amnesia in the artistic context is also possible. I think it happened with Cricot theatre only because in 50s Tadeusz Kantor came with Cricot too. But what's for many people the Cricot too is for many people like the dead class, Wielopole and so on. But for real, it wasn't only Kantor creating Cricot too. It was Kantor, the other painter Miklaszewski, and Maria Jarema, so the lady whose sketches you've seen. And it was so different from the later spectacles in which already the personal, individual style of Kantor appeared. So it was somehow politics by Kantor, which wasn't very connected with the political life as we're discussing now, but it was for artistic reasons.
Just a short comment, because it's really very strange case with Cricot, because Kantor is using this, not Kantor, with Jarema and Mikulski, they all created the Cricot too. So there is the name, everybody knows the name, but at the same time, the famous Kantor's theater totally destroys the memory about first Cricot. So now we have used the Cricot 1 to recall it.
I'm not. I'm trying to.
But on the other hand, do you agree that there was a kind of legend of Cricot, Jarema's Cricot, something that was present in the air, and I for years had this feeling that there was something very important. Everybody is saying, yes, this was important, and no one really knew what it was. On your exhibition, it's really a jump.
I still don't know, actually. I'm still working on that because, first of all, it's very difficult to define what it was. I've just written some article about that, and I've got an impression it's only introductive, and I should make a series of articles about that because it wasn't homogenic. And as I've said, there were some very avant-garde artists like Wiciński, Maria Jarema, and others, and the very academic ones. So, but they were together, so still that was a very collective work. That is very interesting, and that's the value actually of this phenomenon as well. There was, of course, a legend, mainly in Krakow's milieu, which is still somewhere in memories of some, sons, nephews, and so on of ex-Cricot artists. But it's very interesting if you analyze Tadeusz Kantor's articles published in early 50s. It's the same thing that you can read in Jarema's manifestos from 30s. It's exactly the same. And even at 50, it was 55, 56 actually, eventually the inauguration of Cricot 2, and it was with the cuttlefish, so it wasn't by accident at all. And Józef Jarema accepted that they took the name. There is a letter about that written to his sister. And Kantor was interviewed in the radio, and he was like, that was such a great theater, very important, and so on. But sometime after that, when he, I think, noticed that Cricot 2 is very individual which is normal, and it's normal that between generations there are conflicts, and I can understand easily. He's like changing his mind about the importance of the first Cricot, because because he's like furious about, you know, these comparisons and so on. But maybe can I show you just a photograph, because I think it's very important, and maybe that's the occasion mogłabyś mi to moją, because you've seen yesterday and today in our both presentation this photograph from the first official spectacle. And well, actually, just before Cantor started his studies at the Academy of Fine Arts, for 1 year he was a student of the private school of paintings and designs in Krakow, where his professors were mostly Cricot artists. And we know that for the premiere version of that, the students of this very school, well, they co-created costumes and masks. And that was the same year when Cantor studied there. So we don't have proof that he personally participated, but I think for sure he saw it and he was in contact with this milieu. And for sure he saw Liberation and some other spectacles. So my dream is actually to write about the whole Cricot history until the first performances of Cricot too, because I think it will show only that there was something linking that to theaters.
Thank you. We have time, only one question. Just okay. Sorry.
Pointed out to me once that you have Cricot 2, and then by the 70s, Cantor has changed the name to Cricot squared. But the 2 gets displaced from just the end of the name. You can see it on the programs for the dead class. You have Cricot, and then the 2 is placed where you would have a square. So it's the multiple of Cricot rather than, I mean, what you're saying, that something has changed in the conception of the historical genealogy, and it's marked typographically in the program.
I was never thinking about that, actually, so thank you for that. But, you know, very often in Cantor's theater history, it was like by accident that something happened, and then he used that to, you know, invent some ideas and new concepts. But maybe, yeah. Actually, that's very interesting. And actually, in Józef Jarema's writings, I found something about the Cricot 3, so the possible third Cricot, because he was trying somehow, well, he concentrated after the Second World War mostly on the paintings, but there were some attempts to continue some Cricot's ideas, but he didn't have his buddies with him in Rome and then in France when he lived after the war. But he had some kind of idea about the third Cricot.
So we have time, only one last question. Yes, you have been waiting for so long.
It's okay. Yeah, I wanted to ask Karolina, maybe it's like a general comment, because there's a claim that in Poland there was no Dadaism and there was no Surrealism. Like, it's a common claim. And I think of Cricot theater as a kind of incarnation of Dadaism and Surrealism, but the Parisian version only. Like, not the German Dada, the Parisian version of Surrealism and Dadaism, like a kind of a group which referred to that. So I think, also coming back to yesterday, that international constructivism was really like a nomadic avant-garde, but you know, like Surrealism and Dadaism always comes back to the Paris as a kind of a point of reference. And I think this is also important studying Cricot theater to know this Paris connections. I think the theater of what was happening in Paris in the 1920s, the Dadaist performances and Surrealist performances, and the question like how the artists like from Cricot theater commented on that. Like, did they use the word surrealism, for example? Did they use, of course, they staged Mute Canary by Desene, but yeah, I was only thinking about it. They really like were conscious of that. Also, the title, "The Tree of Consciousness," refers to surrealism, very strict, I think.
Yeah, thank you for your comments and your question, which is so important, I think, as the answer, a possible answer, or answers that. So it's very strange because in 20s, so that was the time of this stay in Paris of the group of Capists, and Jarema was there, but they probably weren't so interested by what was really happening, I mean, in the new art, new trends. So, as you know, he never met Prampolini, who was there at that time, and this is so strange with his futurism pantomime theater. He only met him in 1945 in Rome, and they became really buddies, and Prampolini influenced a lot Jarema's painting then. But Jarema returned to Paris in 1934, so it was after the official inauguration of the Cricot Theatre. And then he was really conscious of the importance of new trends. So he met Tristan Tzara, he met Ridmond Desaigne personally, he met this crazy guy, Pierre Albert Bureau, who was the creator of Sick Review, very important, cooperating with Guillaume Apollinaire and others. And all these artists, Tzara, Ridmond Desaigne and Albert Bureau, agreed that Cricot Theatre could stage the dramas. So it was the Mute Canary. Tzara, there was a plan, but it was never staged. And the Cricot Theatre was trying Le Bon Dieu, and in Polish it was translated as Bozia Przedmieszczański, probably. But the censorship entered in Krakow's artists' ideas, and it was stopped, and it was never staged. And for me it's very interesting also because it's very curious. Jarema in 20s, he's in Paris, and all these possibilities of these great contacts. And he starts to realize that only after he returned. And until the end, all his life, he's like regretting that and trying to, you know, do something about that. And there are some writings and letters to Hanna Cybisowa, who was also in this Capist group, and it's from 50s, and he's writing like, it's only now that I have these links and networking, only now, because we lost it in Paris in 20s. So he was very, you know, he was thinking a lot about that. So that is also, but you write some of Cricot's spectacles were really surrealist, and it was both on visual level, and also it regarded texts like Jarema's dramas and also Wielowiejska's ones, some of them.
Yeah, because like Parisian Dadaists all became surrealists at the one time after 1924, almost all. So I think this is like kind of incarnation of Dada and surrealism in 1930s Poland, like happened here.
That's interesting.
I'm thinking about this as a Dadaist surrealist group somehow.
I'm sorry, but I have to close the discussion because of time. So thank you very much for the lectures. Thank you very much for listening to them, and see you within a couple of minutes with the 5th session of the day. So, thank you.
Thank you.